Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don's sitting only temporarily in the host chair. We've arrived at the stoplight, and we're going to do the little fire drill thing. We're all going to run around in the car here because Alexa's going to jump in and grab it here. But I'm joined by Eric Rush. Mr. Rush, how are you in 2023?
So far, so good.
Good deal. Also joined by Eric Darling Bond. They're from a rainy Arizona, which is, I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but how are you doing tonight, Eric?
Oh, I'm having a lovely night, Don. I just found out I got cast in a show, so I'm pretty excited.
Congratulations. And last but certainly not least would be co-founder of the podcast. She also happens to be my daughter. That would be Alexis. Alexis, how are you tonight? And you're going to be the one that takes us away on this one, right?
I am. I'm doing good. And because I'm taking us away, we can probably guess where we're going.
Japan?
Well, that's where we just were.
Oh, well, just us. I mean,
well, in podcast land, that's where we just were.
Northern Ireland?
Close.
That's another one. We'll come back to Northern Ireland, Eric.
Yes. But we're going to go for this episode. We're going back to England, guys. Although, as we talked about off podcast, this has been on the radar, I think, very near the start of the podcast. This has been on the podcast suggestion list for a long time. And we're going to be talking about a little event that you might have heard about in pop culture that happened in 1605.
What was it in November?
It was in November.
Should we remember it?
I think we should. There might have been a comic about it and a movie. Yes, we are going to be talking about the Gunpowder Plot, which was November 5th of 1605. So if you've ever heard the phrase, remember the 5th of November, and you were clueless as to what that was in reference to, it is this specific event. And I will run us a little bit quickly through what did, and then I'll actually throw to Eric Rush because he actually came up with our fork for the episode. So really quickly in the what did, as I mentioned, November 5th, 1605, it is the opening of Parliament, which they still do to this day. So the monarch was supposed to be coming to Parliament to open Parliament, kind of give a speech talking about what he would like Parliament to do in 1605. What was his name for that session of Parliament? In addition to he being there, several members of his family were going to be there, as well as all of the members of the House of Lords, particularly the very high-level lords, were going to be at the opening of Parliament. It was a big deal. So because it was going to be such a big deal, the king was going to be there, several members of the nobility, several members of the extended royal family were going to be there. There was a group of Catholic plotters that got together and they decided, I've had it with the king, I've had it with his family, I want him gone. We want him gone. So the plan was to blow up the Houses of Parliament and subsequently kill the king, several members of his family, and several prominent members of Parliament. These were Catholic conspirators. The king was Protestant. We'll get into this a little bit as we talk through the fork, I'm sure, but England was a relatively new Protestant country, so there was still a majority, or at least a sizable population of Catholics in the country, but because of some laws that were enacted and put into place, they didn't have the clout and the rights that they had previously. So they were a little bit begrudged by that. And so this whole plan was to blow up the Houses of Parliament, blow up the king, blow up several members of the family, several prominent members of the nobility, and then after the aftermath, to install the king's young daughter named Elizabeth. I believe she was about 9 or 10. at the time. So she would have been very much a puppet ruler. But the plan was to extol her as the new monarch and then to essentially rule through her and become a Catholic nation again. So that is, in a nutshell, what happened with, or what was supposed to happen with the Catholic plot. Of course, it did not succeed. And the reason it did not succeed is because the day before, so on November 4th, there was a letter that was sent to a prominent member of parliament who was going to be there on November 5th, who happened to be Catholic. And so there was a letter sent to him basically saying, hey, so I know tomorrow's a big deal, but maybe don't show up because we're planning to kill everybody there. This letter was, of course, they sent it to this man, to an attempt to save him. They wanted him to not be there, so to not die, but also they kind of sent it to him because they kind of figured he wouldn't blab. But that's exactly what he did. He sent it on to the authorities, who were able to then go investigate, and they casually found a guy named Guy Fawkes hanging out in the cellars under the Houses of Parliament with around 36 barrels of gunpowder. So they were able to thwart the plot. So November 5th went on without incident. Parliament opened, nothing happened. Interesting tidbit though, to this day, as part of the ceremony around the opening of Parliament, there actually is somebody who goes down into the cellars of the House of Lords and checks the cellars for gunpowder and other explosives, just to keep up with that tradition of making sure everything's okay before the monarch shows up for the opening day of Parliament.
So just two quick things there before we pass over to Eric Rush, because Eric's going to give us some interesting tidbits that he shared with us on our podcast too. The king here is James I. So this is only 2 years removed from Elizabeth's death. So having been James VI of Scotland, now James I of England, it's not exactly like he's been well established on the throne. And of course, the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots has been an event, 25 years previous, give or take.
Executed because she was very Catholic.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole, this is a continuate, we're not that far removed, even though, see the episode Protestant Win, even though the Armada does not succeed, we are still not that far removed from the same generation that was looking to put a Catholic back on the throne. And with a new king having to have been invited down from Scotland to take that position, even more question about the legitimacy of that. I just want to throw that in, just remind everybody which king we're talking about here. Eric Rush, share with us some of those neat little tidbits you gave us, and some other stuff there is too, and the idea for the fork.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a few little interesting tidbits, and I think one of the things to keep in mind is that as you had alluded to, James I, or James VI of Scotland as well, was not well established on the throne, and because Elizabeth had been so anti-Catholic, there was some curiosity, some hope that James I would have been, if not Catholic himself, as he was not, at least less virulently anti-Catholic. And there was no, unfortunately, there was, well, for these plotters at the very least, there was no evidence that was true. So there was some hope at first, but it didn't really seem to be borne out. And so they were hoping that they would then be able to blow up Parliament, kill the king, kill all the lords, anybody else who was at the event. And then eventually they would be able to reestablish a Catholic monarch, which they were hoping would be Elizabeth, who is a descendant of James the First. I think she was his daughter. Now that I'm thinking about it, and who is believed to be Catholic. So it wasn't really well understood, but that's my recollection of kind of what they were trying to do here. They wanted to reestablish ideally a Catholic England, and if not that, then at least a Catholic tolerant England. Problem is with conspiracies is you can only have a conspiracy if everybody else in your conspiracy is dead, because people don't keep secrets very well. And so the details of the plot were finalized some days before it was scheduled to be done, and then Guy Fawkes would be the person who would actually execute by lighting the fuse, so to speak, and then they would escape. and then they would ensure the capture of this the king's daughter Elizabeth, and then they would somehow, things would happen, and you would have, England would become a Catholic power again. Problem is people talk, and people who are maybe have a little misgiving about what's going on, about all the people that they're planning on killing. Sometimes will try to alert the people that could be present. And so what happened was somebody, and we're not really sure exactly who it was, sent a letter shortly before the plot was supposed to be carried out to William Parker, who is the Baron Monteagle. And what it basically said, and I'll read the letter. And it says, "My lord, out of the love I bear to you, some of your friends, I have a care for your preservation. Therefore, I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this parliament. For God and man hath concurred to punish the wickedness of this time. And think not slightly of this advertisement, but retire yourself into your country, where you might expect the event in safety. For though there be no appearance of any stir, yet I say they shall receive a terrible blow this parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them. This counsel is not to be condemned, because it may do you good and can do you no harm. For the danger is past as soon as you have burnt the letter. And I hope God will give you the grace to make good of use of it, to whose holy protection I commend you." So this is obviously these are not idle words. And so instead of just heeding the words privately, Baron Monteagle handed it to the Earl of Salisbury. And eventually what happened was it started moving up within the nobility of the government. The king was not present during a lot of this. The king was out in Cambridgeshire and was not expected back for some amount of time. But eventually they investigated, and they eventually found they found the quote unquote smoking gun by Guy Fawkes in the basement of the Parliament building. So the point of departure would be, what if this letter had never been written? And because we don't really know exactly who wrote it. Let's say that somebody didn't have a partial change of heart, or didn't really have the need to protect this one noble. If that wouldn't have been done, there's a pretty good chance that the plot would have succeeded. Because we were talking about this off podcast before we started recording. The BBC some years ago did a kind of a redemonstration of what would have happened had the plot succeeded, and they used 36 barrels of, in some cases, partially spoiled or stale gunpowder, and to see if that would still succeed in blowing up the building, and it absolutely would have. So had this succeeded, you would have killed everybody in the building, and so it would have been quite the event. Doubtful that it would have ended up the way that the conspirators hoped it would have ended up, but it would have killed the people that they intended to kill. So that's my point of departure: is no letter to William Parker. So
if nobody tips off the fact that, and by the way, it wasn't just a simple, "Hey, don't go tomorrow." What was that, like 3 paragraphs worth? I mean,
it was several warnings, and I think God and man have concurred to punish the wickedness of the time. Yeah, that's those are strong words.
Those are strong words, and making the point, as you said, multiple times about what the risk and the fact that this was serious. And I think it's easy for me where I would just jump in as a reminder here that even though Elizabeth reigned for 50 years, it was a long reign. There were still the streams of there were still staunch Catholics during Elizabeth's reign. There were still those that were there. This was still something that was real, but it had become less. There was less of an expectation that, barring something, as you said, dramatic after James I comes, and he's clearly going to continue with the Anglican Church. Now this idea that we have to do something more extreme. It's not just find another monarch to put on the throne, but now we've got to do something that's a little bit more. And the other thing that struck me is just terrorism. This would have been an extreme act of terrorism. The analogy that ran into my head when Eric was sharing the fact that This would have actually done the damage. This would have killed, I started thinking about modern acts of terrorism where, improvised fertilizer bombs and the other things that we're aware of, the World Trade Center bombing, for example, that, predated the events of 9/11. This would have been of that ilk, just in an entirely different era where gunpowder was the way that it was done. So if we take away the latter, we assume then that the logical fork is going to be that we have the explosion. Now, if I understood correctly, James is not actually I guess the first question to establish is James killed in that explosion?
He probably would have been. He was back by the 1st of November. Okay. He should have been there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the one thing I guess I didn't know until digging this a little bit deeper is that eventually we do have James's oldest son is Henry, who predeceases. And so at this particular point in 1605, the heir to the throne would have been Henry, who is not yet of age, who would have required a regency. Correct? Is that the right summary that I'm thinking about here?
Yeah, he would have been about 10 or 11 years old at this point.
So pretty much all of James's heirs at this point would have required a regency.
Would have been pretty young. Yep, exactly.
And so, of course, the other thing to remember there is, this is fresh in my mind because I've been re-listening to Garrett Mattingly's The Armada, which is a fantastic, well-written book on the Spanish Armada. And I'm just got through the chapters where it's setting up, with the execution of the Mary Queen of Scots and the whole thing there, is that while she is James's mother, they are very much estranged. So while she is a staunch Catholic, he has almost been raised intentionally removed from her influence in such a way that he is not that, which is why it was, quote unquote, safe for those who wanted to have a successor to Elizabeth to invite James to come among all the possible claimants. Because by that point, there were a lot of folks who could make a somewhat legitimate claim to the throne. And then the other thing that jumped out at me, this is a little bit of an aside, but a tangent, is recently as Charles took the monarchy, remember one of the first things that he did were signing things that related to the Church of Scotland. This is this connection between Scotland and England that goes back to this point of James being brought in. So we lose James and we pick up let's assume a King Henry here, a young King Henry. So I guess the first thing is, what does that look like, particularly after these events? I mean, what's the front end of this fork in terms of how much chaos gets caused and what happens, before we go further down it, what happens in the near term?
Well, first of all, the original plan was not for Henry or even Charles. It was for the daughter Elizabeth.
It was for the daughter Elizabeth. Yeah.
Reason being for that, Henry does die young. He is determined to be feeble by the conspirators, why they don't pick him, because for all intents and purposes, he should have been the choice. But they don't pick him because it's determined that he is feeble, weak. They don't want to mess with that. They don't want to pick Charles because Charles would have required that minority for a long time. Wouldn't have been able to rule in his own right. So they go with Elizabeth, assuming that she can be raised Catholic. She's about 9 or 10 at this point, so she could kind of be converted. She's young enough. She's in that age of influence. And they could also marry her to a Catholic consort. So if we're going to change the fork even more, and we're going to go with Henry, first off the bat, you're going to have a sibling thing, possibly, especially if the conspirators were thinking Elizabeth the whole time, where it's like, hey, we were going to go with Elizabeth. It's like, well, you killed the king and he's got an older son, so we're going to go with Henry.
Yeah, or in another way, someone just says, let's not be ableist about this. I mean, yeah, he's sickly, but, things could turn around. That's not stopping him. Baldwin IV was a leper, and he was a pretty good king of Jerusalem. Let's get this kid on the throne. Henry.
Multiple kings of France.
Yeah.
But was he really sickly until his terminal illness? I mean, Sorry, go ahead, Don.
I was about to ask that same question, Eric. So please go ahead. My understanding is at this point, this is before he's been stricken with
he had typhoid fever. Yeah. Well, and then typhoid fever. I mean, that was a reality at the time. I don't think that speaks to his constitution. I think it just speaks to the, the nature of the time. But it sounds like, the history was that he was, he liked things like, jousting and horseback riding and things like that would indicate that he had a pretty reasonable constitution.
Yeah,
Played
golf. I actually read something where it said that he owned golf clubs was one of the things that popped up in one of the things I was looking at there.
There you go.
The other thing to consider is, would he have been killed? Would he have been with his father? I mean, if you think about modern opening of parliaments, let's go back to Elizabeth. Most of the time, Charles was also there as the heir. So
that's a good point.
Is Henry also dead? And so we have either a Charles or an Elizabeth that we're dealing with as the successor.
That's interesting. I and I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know. I assume that information is available about who was in attendance.
Or who would have been in attendance. Obviously, they changed the plans once they find the plot, I think, in terms of what's going on there. Because I think the Parliament actually didn't then open as a result of that until January, because they postponed its opening. But I think Alexis hit it on the head earlier about part of the reason you choose the female claimant is that lets you set up whatever marriage situation you want to whoever there. It's a lot easier to do that with
technical difficulties.
I think so. We're just going to talk here. Don has.
I'm back. I know you lost me there. I'm back now. So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah. So my point is, it's easier then to control the outcome when you're guiding the female monarch that you've placed on the throne to who you want to marry and set up the scenario there. Given the time.
Yeah, much easier. All right, so we're going with Elizabeth.
Well,
or are we going with Charles? Because we do have an older son. Even if Henry's gone,
I like the simpler path of not having this, race with two child monarchs figuring out who to. Although that would be an interesting, scenario because that would make it a little more complicated. But the idea of Elizabeth
Charles
being
like 5.
Yeah, Charles is very young. Very young.
I think we were, because Charles was the one who was very ill as a child. So he was the one who was seen because he had rickets. And I am reading here that apparently Henry told him he'll make him Archbishop of Canterbury when he was king. So he would have a long robe to hide his ugly legs because everybody is a jerk.
Don't worry, brother. I'll give you a job.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, if we assume that they are, is it a fair thing to say that Elizabeth then let's make a couple of assumptions here so we're not coming around. Henry dies in the blast along with his father, so that removes him. Now Elizabeth is the oldest; she's older than Charles, correct? So that puts her appropriately in line, unless you're going to go find somebody else. And so there's the effort to put by the conspirators. There's the effort to put her on the throne. So she's, I guess, would my first question is, would somebody else have advanced? Would the Protestants have advanced somebody, be it a young Charles or be it somebody else to try to take the throne? How likely would that have been?
I think there would have been a very, very swift reaction against Catholics in England. I think they would have. I think it would have been pretty dramatic, and I think that there was, even though there was a strong anti-Catholic sentiment, both legally and just in culturally there, it would have been far fiercer.
Okay, so do you think under that scenario, Eric, that we get Elizabeth on the throne with the Protestant powers that be that have survived, prosecuting against the conspirators here and rooting out, whatever remains of Catholicism in England, and we still have Elizabeth. It's just not the Elizabeth they hope to get by installing her and then marrying her off at young age?
Yeah, I think that's likely. I mean, I think you could. I think you could get a much more. We'll say a much stauncher kind of obligate Protestantism like what existed in Scandinavia at the time, in England, and so it would have been, it would have been that everybody would have just had to be Anglican at that point.
Okay. So under that scenario, do we end up with much of a conflict, or do you think it's taken care of pretty quickly that they?
I think it's taken care of pretty quickly. I don't. I mean,
So is this a blip, or does this carry on for a while?
Oh, I think it. I think it leaves. I think it's a traumatic event. I think it leaves. It definitely leaves a mark kind of on the national psyche. But I don't think in terms of any sort of political changes. I don't think it really changes the path all that much. Although I have to say is you might have a little more zeal and embrace of the Stuart monarchy, what's left of it, because keep in mind what happens not 40
Right.
years after this. Do you have a Commonwealth? Do you have a protectorate? What happens to Cromwell?
Right.
Maybe nothing. Maybe there is no Cromwell.
Right.
And so if you remove that part, what we know as the coming history from 1605, if you remove that out, that probably has as much or more of an impact long term in terms of not having that period in the Restoration and everything that went with that. And as you said, eventually we lose Stuarts here. Eventually we have to go to somebody else here pretty quickly just because of what happens as we move forward over time.
Yeah, one quick thing on that, interestingly enough, this Elizabeth we're talking about, her, I believe it's grandson, is a person by the name of George the First. Just
Yeah.
tying that full circle there. Yeah, we got to go to Germany, but the line still carries. But it's interesting because the reason we got to go to Germany is because we got to make a Protestant jump because we had gone back to Catholic for a second. I don't think that happens if we have a successful gunpowder plot, because I think, to Eric's point, I think it gets snuffed out pretty quickly. I think that it kind of becomes that more hardline Protestant. We're with the Stuarts because the Stuarts that survived, we're with them, we back them. I think it becomes more entrenched Protestant. So there's not that whoopsie flip back to Catholicism for a second with James II. So you don't even have to go to, and we have Elizabeth who's possibly not marrying Frederick of the Palatine. So you're not doing that. I'm curious, and Eric, you might be able to speak to this because you watched that demonstration for the BBC. So with that 36 barrels of gunpowder, what was all destroyed?
Everything.
Did it go beyond the Houses of Parliament into London? Because I'm curious to explore you kind of touched on it, the social ramifications.
I think obviously there's shrapnel flying at everywhere, and so if there are people kind of standing nearby, they would likely have been injured or killed as well. But as far as London, overall, would it destroy a large swath of that part of the city? I don't think it would. But so it would be the building and immediate environs that would have been destroyed. Yeah, but it's an important question, Alexis.
And the symbolic nature of what used to be there that you looked at and recognized as the government, an important part of the government, even though you have a monarchy. I mean, you do have it is moving towards it is constitutional monarchy, different than it becomes, but is still there. And suddenly, it's like looking at the skyline of New York without the Twin Towers. Imagine you're in London looking over to the things you're accustomed to seeing there on the Thames, and they're not there anymore. And that reminds you of why they're not there constantly, which is I think the immediate thing that happens. To your point, Eric, earlier about is there more of a we're going to root out these last roots of Catholicism. Look at what they've done. Where it becomes an even stronger Protestant control. And then what does that mean, down the road, either, and because of that, is there more of the circling, to your point, more of the circling of the wagons around, the Stuarts, and now in the case of Elizabeth being in the, is there more of a, we're going to support this because we're not going to tolerate, people putting an end to us choosing, us being God choosing who the next monarch's going to be, for us, kind of thing.
Yeah, I kept circling back to the 9/11 episode that we did, and you brought up 9/11, and this is I mean, this was a terrorist attack in 1605. Just kind of that concept of when we think the Twin Towers, there were so many things that were destroyed that weren't the Twin Towers in that general area. Of course, jet fuel is different than gunpowder. But talking about also, we talked about in that episode about if that fourth plane and if it had actually hit in DC, and the fact that there's so many things that get kind of packed into that one area in DC that if they hit their target, but then it kind of goes out from there. So I was just curious to kind of explore that aspect. But yeah, I think I think Eric hit it on the head earlier, to borrow the phrase from the last episode we recorded. This isn't a big political thing. I think it gets resolved pretty quickly, but I think a social thing of, if you live in London, you see, the smoldering House of Parliament. I think that kind of lives in the psyche for quite a while.
Well, I will say it also probably does create a small political chasm, because now the heads of many different houses all across England and Scotland are dead. So it's a whole new generation that's just kind of forced in, that came of age probably later on during the 30 Years' War. So now we have this new generation that has to learn the realms of power. I was also trying to look up just now, so who would have been put in charge of the regency? And then the further I kept going, it's like, oh, everybody that's connected to the Stuarts is dead. And most of them pretty horribly. Like, this family seems cursed.
Yeah.
But also,
no, it's a valid point. You would have to search around for the regent. The question I would have is Anne, so Anne of Denmark is James's wife, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is she there
at the opening?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a tough one.
I think the answer to that is no. I don't think she's there, and so I think she's regent.
Yeah, I tried looking up to see when James was hooking up with Robert Carr, but unfortunately they didn't meet for another 2 years.
Yeah, that's a really good thought, though. Had the history been reversed a little bit, because that would have been a really interesting one.
Yeah, it'd be like the first super sitcom of the modern era. Like, I've been raised by my dad's boyfriend. Like, he's gone, but other dad is here. My two dads. There we go. We brought him.
And so now to me that's another interesting point is, if you have a young Protestant queen on the throne, look, I think it's a safe assumption. I don't think, Eric, to your point, I don't think Anne is at the opening, so she's probably there to serve as regent. She's from Denmark, hence the name Anne of Denmark. And so, one of the things that pops into my head was very common in this period, still common to this day, is, are there other Protestant nations who suddenly now feel like they either can exert influence in England to some degree, or want to, sort of come in and be a protector of the faith type of thing? Does that change the alignment, given that we're about to go into a religious, another religious war in Europe to a degree that's about to happen here? Does that have some impact on that in terms of, does Scotland gain more of an influence because some of the family having come from Scotland has to play a bigger role? As I think Eric DB makes a great point in the idea of, all those older sons now suddenly just take the reins of all those various lordships. That's a whole generational change out. I mean, it's a pretty dramatic thing to have happen there. And do you have more external influence into England coming from someplace else, Denmark, wherever it might be coming from, that's coming in initially to be supportive of a Protestant queen, but they're also going to take whatever liberties they can in terms of what will benefit them while they're doing that.
Well, I think you could. Because I think not. This is the House of Oldenburg, right, in Denmark, and House of Oldenburg is not just Denmark. It's Norway. I don't think it's Sweden at this point, but it had been Sweden. I think they had electors in the Holy Roman Empire, so they had their tendrils all throughout Protestant Europe. And
currently at this time, it is Christian IV, Anne's brother, who will reign until 1648 and be the longest reigning monarch of Denmark, Norway, and being the Duke of Holstein and Schleswig.
There you go. Okay, that's helpful. And I think the answer is yes. I think you do see, more, we'll call this more Danish or at least House of Oldenburg influence, because we know this is possible because we saw this 100 years later with the House of Orange, right?
Right.
So, we saw Dutch influence. So this is just Danish influence a little bit earlier. So I think it's very possible.
Yeah. And to me, that's the interesting thing here is that, nature abhors a vacuum. Leadership abhors a vacuum, and so somebody's going to try to fill that vacuum. And when what's filling the vacuum rightfully is a minor monarch that's in a regency position, and then who else can influence that? They're going to try to influence it for whatever's there. So to me, that's an interesting thought, and I personally believe this would have led to a much more not that Catholicism was tolerated necessarily in England. Certainly there had been, the issues that had arisen post Henry all the way through up to leading to this, but I think you get a renewed sense of it being, it would not just be sometimes looked over like it would have been, because the reminder would have been what Catholics allowed to not be, kept in their proper place relative to a Protestant throne, what that means. And the other thing that ran into my mind, sort of the reason I went to the 9/11 is that, this is remembered because of the rhyme as the 5th of November. We talk about 9/11. I don't think they would have referred to it as 11/5, but you've got that same type of mindset that goes on there where it influences things for decades and generations to come, calling back to it. There's always that concern about, let's not have another 11/5.
Well, do you know what doesn't get created if we don't have the 5th of November as, a failed gun plot? There's no Halloween, babe. There's no more Halloween. You know what that means? It means our Halloween special, Don, never gets made because it doesn't become Pope's Day, which turns into Papistry Day here on the East Coast in Boston, which then turns into Halloween. So we have no tradition. We just have creepy Christmas still with mummers.
There you go.
Well, that's a bummer. I don't like this
episodes away.
So I was interested in this alternate history, and now I don't want it anymore.
Yeah, that's right. Hocus pocus, never gonna happen now.
Oh well,
never see
Batman. Yeah, don't tell my kids that.
And this raises a tougher question for me. Is we often struggle with going down alternate history paths. It's whether you're changing the history, whether the fork is changing an event from a did to a didn't, or a didn't to a did, is sometimes they're similar, but sometimes they're very different in the sense of yes, there was a plot, the plot was uncovered, a letter was written, all the things that are there, but there's not a massive rebuilding program for a House of Parliament or so, the type of thing that, mars the London landscape for a period of time in quite the same way. Or, what invariably happens, what could have happened from that is this tangential thing you don't even often think about is, okay, they have to raise taxes for that. And as a result of that, somebody gets upset about the increase in taxation for rebuilding Parliament. And so, this is the time of the Cromwell and the rise of the Roundheads, and again, why are we even doing all this? Why don't we just have why do we have a monarchy at all, kind of deal?
Oh, well, what I also just think of, the King James Bible will not be written. The Geneva Bible that the Protestant, that Puritans love, probably becomes a lot more popular. Also, Shakespeare gets arrested because he wrote Macbeth and he wrote Hamlet, which is about the Danish royal families. And then suddenly the king is dead and there are just a Danish royal house largely given a lot of influence. It's probably very awkward to perform those plays. Those plays get known as cursed. This play literally got King James killed.
So, well, the King James Bible it wasn't complete by this point, but it had been started, right?
Yeah, because
would it have been
1604?
So maybe it was started, or maybe, or at the very least, if it's not, maybe not completed, or at least it looks a lot different, and it's not the King James Bible. Maybe it's the Queen Elizabeth or King Charles Bible, and it looks quite a bit different. I don't know. I mean, but Eric, you bring up a really good point that it can't be the same. Like, there's no way for it to be the same.
Yeah, and to me, the other thing that goes with that, is that part of the King James Bible is also James, being a very smart politician, is still understanding the nature of the religious conflict that's going on here, and and the fact that there's the recognition there needs to be a Bible in English that is we call it the King James Bible. The official name for it, of course, is the Authorized Version, because there were other Bibles running around in English. They just weren't the official Authorized Version, for all the benefit that gave and didn't give. But the other thing that just ran through my head was, coming off of the 50-year reign by Elizabeth, and again, I'm influenced a lot right now by listening to to Mattingly describe that in the Armada. There was a lot of ups and downs. Elizabeth dealt with things all the way through there, but the one thing Elizabeth brought was stability for that 50-year period of time. I mean, the magic of Elizabeth is navigating to stay on the throne during that contentious period of time, given all things that were there for 50 years. I mean, that was her gift, and she did it by hook and by crook sometimes. But so you go from this very stable 50-year reign to James has been on the throne for 2 years. And now suddenly you're back into this whole cycle of, are we going to do this? Are we going to constantly be changing now? Are we going to go back? I think of the period of time, with Mary and Elizabeth. I call that the whipsaw period. If you were an English citizen, it's, what am I this week? When I'm going to church this week, what do I need to be? Because okay, Mary, it was back and forth. I mean, it was, and the Lords were having a tough time figuring out, they may have leaned, for example, theologically Catholic, but I need to be Protestant right now, or the other way around. I mean, it was, you played the middle there as best you could. And so I began to wonder, one of the things that Elizabeth brought and James then continued for a period of time, we see the instability that's going to come in the 20 to 30 years forward. If you accelerate, in other words, is the 2-year reign of James dying by assassination in a massive terrorist act, does that bring an era of instability back that undoes that 50 years of Elizabeth plus what you normally had with James there, if that makes any sense? I went the long way around the block to say that.
Yeah. Oh, but I did look it up. King James Bible officially published 1611.
Yeah.
Yeah. But commissioned 1604, like Alexis said. So.
Right. Yeah. It had just been commissioned.
Yeah.
So. In fact, I don't think I've ever read this relative to the Gunpowder Plot, but it's interesting that it was commissioned in 1604, and here we are in 1605. It was just that further indication of there was still the religious tension that was going on behind the scenes.
Especially because he was a Calvinist, which a lot of Protestants hated.
Well, you make an excellent point there, Eric. Without delving too far into the theology of that, the Scottish flavor of Protestantism was not the Anglican flavor of Protestantism. Yes, they were both Protestants, but it was not. I mean, the Church of England,
quite a bit different.
Yeah, the Church of England still looks very Catholic, except for the head, in a lot of ways. Scotland had gone through an entirely different experience during the Reformation, and James was very much influenced by Knox and the others. It was Scottish, as you said, Scottish Calvinism. Scottish Protestantism was not English Protestantism, and it's easy to forget that because we use the same term to describe both of them.
Yeah. Oh, I thought of one more thing that gets interfered with because there's no James to end it. Trade with Japan. So the only reason that the English stopped going to Japan and establishing more contacts is James felt it was too expensive to maintain.
Yeah, and to me, the other interesting part about that, and again, now my brain is turning about those differences that happened there. Again, heavily influenced by hearing a lot about Elizabeth right now, is England had established itself as a nautical power, particularly with the Armada victory being what it was. It became about English power here, but it was not still from a standpoint of wealth or trade anywhere close to many of its European counterparts. I mean, part of the reason that Spain was able to mount the Armada was with the resources they had to be able to mount that. In England, England was fortunate, you might argue, because of the weather situation to avoid the consequences of that. And so you still have an England here, be it James or be it Elizabeth or whatever, that is still economically lagging behind much of the rest of the continent and will be for some period of time. It's not until later that changes to any degree. It's going to change, but it's not going to change in the near term. They're still, I guess my point, they're still dependent upon relationships with Europe because they're not economically able to stand on their own at this point. And so if you alter the need for help from a Denmark or some other Protestant power in Europe to help, protect yourself, what does that mean? I mean, is there who is the king in Spain at this point? Is it still I don't know, that's chasing you a little bit, but is there another thought? Oh, okay, now here's another chance, kind of thing. Elizabeth's gone and James gone as well. What else is lurking out there in this alternate timeline? Anybody thought of anything else?
So it's Philip the Fourth. Who's the king of Spain?
Yeah.
I don't have anything on this timeline. I just I continually am looking forward to retiring to my English country manor. That's all.
So should we all?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. By the way, if you want to do that, don't marry American actresses. I'm just saying that in the current events right now, that precludes you being.
I bought the book today. And what's really funny is I came home and Jake was unpacking the bags and he goes, "I knew you would."
I really like the interview on Colbert.
I haven't seen the whole interview yet.
It's good. It's just kind of confirmed my whole thing of like, the older I get, the more I'm thinking like, man, monarchy just seems like child abuse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the last question I'm going to ask, just to sort of bring us to a conclusion and circle things up, what do they rebuild there? Because that's the interesting concept to me. I think Alexis and I talked about that briefly. If the Capitol had been hit during the 9/11 scenario or the White House, sort of there's, and then what we saw with 9/11 with the Twin Towers. Well, we didn't build two towers back. We just built a larger single tower back as a point of show there. But that's different when that's a sign of commerce versus it being, related to your seat of government. So I'm just curious, do they build something back there? And in what way is it different than what we know because of how that changes things?
I think you do build something. I think it is grander than what was there previously. And I think it is intended to be we'll call it a statement of nationalism. Now, whether that is English nationalism or whether that is an emerging sense of a concept of Britishness that will exist later on, I don't know. Probably the former in 1605. So I suspect it will embody a sense of nationalism.
Okay, that would be my thinking as well, and it would become symbolic for ways that it's not symbolic today.
Absolutely agree.
And I even, the other thing that my mind ran to when I knew we were going to talk about this topic is because it's still carrying over with the religious conflict there, is there something about that would be, yes, it would embody, as you point out, well, I think, Eric, a national identity. It's nationalism. It's about continuation of government. But would it somehow be more religiously connected because it has the religious, the Catholic prodders being there? Would you somehow end up with, I guess at this point, Westminster Abbey exists, right? I mean, it's not like but would you incorporate some type of national Anglican church, as part of this, what gets rebuilt there, just as further sign of saying we are asserting that we are Protestant, we are not Catholic.
If not official, then at least there would be, vestiges of Anglicanism there. But I also wonder, so we've kind of agreed that we think that there would be a doubling down on the Anglican Church as a part of this. How does this affect relations with Ireland? And I think there's, I mean, and we're close to an hour, and I think a lot of us have to wrap up here.
Yeah.
And so we could make this a 2-part episode
Part
at some point.
two.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to come back to.
But I think the answer is not well.
Right.
I mean, we can flesh that out, but I think the short answer is not well. And I think this has implications, between 1605 to 1922. I mean, I think you've got a lot of implications there. So I would be interested in exploring that as a person who is descended from many English Catholics. I think that would be really, really interesting to explore.
Okay. We will cue that one up because I agree with you. I think it's an interesting place to go, and it's a further extension of this. So that's our signal for us to bring this one around to a close. So once again, thanks for joining A Fork in Time. I just want to mention, as we always do, check out the website. There's all kinds of fun stuff there, including our back catalog, the links to our Discord server, ways that you can support the show both financially and otherwise. I do encourage you we can get activity going back in on the Discord server. I really enjoyed that interaction with our listeners. So I know with a new episode out here, we'll be able to get more of that. So I just say, if you have different thoughts than what we've expressed here, there's a place to go and do that. There's feedback on the website. The Discord server is a little bit more in real time, but we don't think we've got the answers here. That's the magic of alternate history. Is you could be just as right as I believe that I am, and we don't know, but it's worth the discussion. So on behalf of Alexis, Eric, and Eric, I just want to say once again, thanks for joining us here on A Fork in Time. And we didn't close out another episode this way, so now I'm inclined to do it. I'm seeing my daughter here on the left. Do we have any suggestions for our listeners if they happen upon A Fork in Time, Lex?
Take it.
Take it. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.